My name is Greg Delaney. I'm from Xenia, Ohio. I have 15 years in recovery. And today I'm a father, I'm a grandfather. I'm also a pastor.
If you could start off by sharing a bit about your childhood.
Well, so my childhood was great. My parents were incredibly involved in my growing up. I grew up in Xenia, where I live now. I tell people all the time that I was a part of a faith community before I was even on the planet. There's pictures of me in my mom's belly singing in the choir, right? And so, and that'll have relevance in a second. But two wonderful parents, grew up in the suburban neighborhood, and, involved in my school, and did the stuff in elementary school. Really had a fantastic upbringing. And so, graduate from high school, go on to college. I met my wife. She's my high school sweetheart. We've been together 42 years. We both go off to college, get married, and we didn't even have alcohol at our wedding. It just wasn't part of the equation, if that's the best way to say it. And but it wasn't that I hadn't had it at the bachelor party and that sort of thing. But the kind of the seminal moment for me when it came to alcohol was I had gotten fired from a job. And so some of those expectations, and I had a really dear friend. His name is Greg as well. And we'd grown up together in school. He had gone off to Ohio State, and he was part of that party culture. And so the day I got fired, he was my neighbor, and so I went down, to just kind of, hey man, I just got fired, and it's not great. And he's like, you know what? I got just the thing for that. And so we drove to the Honk and Holler drive-through, and at the time it was an innocuous moment, right? But we got a couple Busch Light 40s, went back to his driveway and just drank them. And I didn't know, like I said at the time, but when I look back on it now, it happened in my mid-20s. But there was something that had happened in my life that wasn't great, and that alcohol made it better. And it was almost like a little pilot light kind of went off. And it didn't like immediately, I was just there. And so I came out of that job, and I ended up having another job opportunity open up in the tech center, or the kind of the tech business. And so you're thinking about early 90s. It was a really way to make a lot of money. And so I had some success there. But some of those same stressful challenges led me to starting to seek that out a little bit more. But the challenge was there was this life of expectation over here in the church, in leadership in the church. And my church, it wasn't about alcohol, was super taboo, as I mentioned. So over here was this life of me. But as I was gaining success and there was stress along with that success, there was this other thing that I was starting to find to be helpful, life of me. And so the two of them couldn't meet. And then as that success went up, then there were certain expectations that went with being in the business world. And I ended up being an international marketing manager. And so really had a lot of success, started to make a lot of money. But in that space, there was expectation of ordering the right wine, and having a cocktail with dinner, and all of that. So the most that I could do was keep those two things apart. And I kept them apart for quite a while. But as with anything, the progression of my illness really started to take hold. And so all that wonderful job and all the money and all the performance, my performance started to reflect, what was happening. And so what was always, I'll never drink till after work, kind of moved to 4 o'clock, kind of moved to 2 o'clock, kind of moved to lunch. I'll never drink on a Sunday because that's the Lord's day. And then I'm seeking out places that are selling, booze on Sunday, so that I can do that. So it had gotten to the place where the simplest of tasks became almost impossible. And so I kept getting fired, which in turn bankrupted me. So they came to get my house. And I was so into my illness, Aaron, that there were moments in time that I don't have recollection of. And there's terrible stories I could tell you if you want to hear them, but there was a point in time that my daughter, so I have 3 children, my middle daughter, who is the apple of my eye, she was a little tiny thing, and they were taking the furniture out of our home. And here comes her furniture out of the house, right? And she tells me, Daddy, what are they going to do with my furniture, right? And I'll be honest, I don't remember it. I don't remember much about a couple of years.
Yeah.
There's pictures. I dyed my hair. Don't remember that. I mean, so there was this general, like you talk about chaos, but there was this almost sleepwalking, numb type thing that began to, and then simple things like doing the laundry seemed overwhelming. So you would think it would that would be the end, right? But it wasn't. And so the reason I mentioned that friend that we had gone to the honk and holler with, he struggled like I did for a long time. So there were points in time, and I'm sure you've had other people talk about this, that there was these ebbs and flows where people go get recovery for 10 minutes, and then suddenly they want to be the hero and save somebody else, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what me and Greg were. Greg would go off to treatment for 10 minutes. He'd come back and say, I got to get you into treatment. You got to get better, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And then, and then he would fall off and I would go into treatment and I'd come back out and I'd help him. But the tragedy, and again, there's lots of the story, but the tragedy happened in July of 2008. And the sheriff had come to the house and they said, do you know where he is? Because they knew we were friends. And I was like, no. The reason I didn't know where he was because I was drunk. And they found him 2 days later. And he had a lot that was crashing down on him, like I had crashing down on me, and so there was this point in time where, and he had some other challenges, and again, we had been friends since we were kids, right? And so he had completed suicide and he hanged himself, and he was surrounded by that distilled vodka stuff, right? And it was a tragic story. Yeah. But there's a great ending to it that hopefully will bring some inspiration. But so it's the day of his funeral, and I'm supposed to be a pallbearer. This is my friend,
right?
And I wake up that morning, and I woke up like I woke up every morning when I was in the mess, and that was, okay, I got to get something on board to get through the day. So I think I'll get settled. And then I'm not feeling great, and I'm like, well, I'm kind of hungry. So we had a McDonald's up the street from the house. So I drove to McDonald's and got a sandwich, and then I started to get sick. And so I started throwing up blood in the McDonald's parking lot. And so, I get on the phone and I called my wife and I said, look, I'm not going to be able to go to the funeral. And it was just one, if you had 7 hours, you could go through all of the times that I was a huge, jacked up vacations, jacked up, dates out with friends, because I was trying to hide it. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense?
Yeah.
And so I call her, and again, she's the most sensitive, spiritual, loving, resilient woman on the planet. And she had gotten to the place where she had done her work with Al-Anon and done her work with her recovery, and so she had gotten that place of acceptance. And little did I know that during some of this journey, she had actually made arrangements of what life was going to look like without me.
Wow.
She had made arrangements with one of my best friends to raise my children. So she had done her homework. And so when I called, she's like, I really don't care. It's just one more disappointment. It's okay. I'm not surprised. Mm-hmm. Get in the car, I drive myself to Miami Valley Hospital in Dayton. And I get there, and it's just the drill, right? I've done it 100 times. So I get out my insurance card, my driver's license. You're going to do my SIWA test. It's going to be in and out. I'm going to get a little ammonia flushed out of me. I'll get a B vitamin. You're going to give me a sandwich. 3-4 days, right as rain. Go back to the lie. It's all good, right? And so my wife is the palliative care director at that hospital at the same time. So this is her hospital. These are her folks. And I had done treatment there, done detox there. So it was like, frequent flyer. Hey, there's Greg. And but I think, and hopefully this is okay for this, is that God had something very different in that moment.
God's always okay.
Yeah.
It's your story.
Right. And so my wife comes to work, and I'm on the telemetry floor. That's where you always go, and she gets a call from the ICU. And these are her friends. So she was palliative care. So she had the task of daily in the ICU helping to navigate families for folks who are in an end-of-life crisis. And so she's ushered thousands of folks to the other side, whatever that is, based on what you believe, and then helping families navigate that grief and navigate those ending times. And so coming to the ICU was just part of the day. And so some of her wonderful colleagues had said, you need to come to the ICU. And she's like, okay. And she's like, and they're like, it's about Greg. And she's like, well, Greg's on telemetry. They said, no, you need to come down here.
Wow.
So her colleague, Tom Donnelly, who is, I today owe much to him. He pulls the curtain back and presents this question to my wife. He says, I think we should resuscitate him at least once. What do you think? And she's like, what's happening? And he says his pulse is 195, his blood pressure is 70/40, his bilirubin's off the chart. He's going to die. And my wife, again, who is this remarkable, you need to have her do a story about her side of it, but she says she sat there in stunned silence because she had prepared for it, but now she's in it, right? And she looked at her friends and she says, I trust you so very much. I love you. You're good at what you do. So you do whatever's best for him. And she said, I took my nurse's hat off. And then she put her wife hat on. And this is a wife who I had dishonored with so much, in the strip club, and dishonored with lying, dishonored with, in that bankruptcy that we went through, she lost her retirement. I mean, she had every reason to say good riddance, right? And she tells the story of going off into the cubby there off the ICU floor and just looking up to the Lord and saying, Lord, he's tormented by this thing. I know that he accepted you when he was 13 years old. So I'm just going to let you know, if you want him, I'm okay with that. I'm good. You can have him. If you leave him here, will you please heal him? And then she walked out to the ICU and said, I'm going home. And she went home. They figured out I was septic. Lots of antibiotics, lots of great doctors, lots of awesome people. And obviously I made it through the other side of it. But 3 days later I woke up and I was at the Valley. And in my room was a pastor from my town named Mark Brooks. And he's like, and I'll trim it down. He's like, the Lord told me you're going to be my recovery pastor. And I'm like, bro, I'm a drunk. There's no way. And I had never felt more disowned, disenfranchised than when I was in church. It was the last place. So much shame, right? And he's like, no, the Lord told me that's what you're going to do. That was something very different than anything I'd ever thought about being. I was a sales guy. I was a marketing guy. I was going to have to get back into business, even though I couldn't even hold a job for $9 an hour. And that's what I had always tried. I'd always tried to go back and leverage a relationship or find somebody, and took advantage of dear friends during that time and took money, and it was just awful. And this was a new thing. And then suddenly there was going to be ministry in it. But they said, this is what you can be. And because I have a lot of people that come up and ask, say, well, was it the consequence of the bankruptcy? Was it almost dying in the hospital? Was it this? And I was like, no, it was somebody that saw something different in me and was willing to back it up with action and came alongside me. And the interesting part about Mark, and he wouldn't have any trouble with me telling you this, Mark had his own issue with alcohol. Mark had his own expectations. He was the son of a pastor. Mark had an adulterous affair with his, and left his wife. But he had this incredible story of restoration. And he wasn't perfect. And he's quirky still. I mean, we're still best of friends. But he saw something different in me. And there wasn't a lot of expectation. And the big part was there was no shame. And so that first year of recovery, I invested in myself in that meeting, invested myself in church. I invested myself in a 12-step fellowship for about 90 days. But after a year at the church, was called a House of Prayer in Xenia, Mark said, I want to ordain you in the ministry. And so he ordained me in 2009, and I became part of the staff. And I was on staff there and really invested in this whole idea of Freedom Church and faith-based recovery and So I kind of evolved from the 12-step piece and began to see, what does God have to say about this whole journey of addiction, and really started to mine into that. And so a grant came available for me to kind of go up, and we wanted to build a program of creating advocates inside churches that could help be navigators for people, looking for help with substance use.
Yeah.
So it's called the Champions Program. So I went up there and worked for him for about a year, and in that process I got to meet then Attorney General Mike DeWine's heroin team. And Mr. DeWine, had a vision of, during the height of the opiate epidemic, saying, we really need the church's help. And so in 2018, I'm sitting at my desk and I get a note from the White House. And I'm like, we'd like you to come to the White House. And I'm like, man, I'm a clown. There's no way. And so I'm like, okay. And so I reached out to a dear friend of mine. I said, this has got to be fake. And he's like, nah, man, it's not fake. And I was like, okay. So I replied back. And at the time, Melania was kind of taking on the role of being kind of this head on the overdose stuff under the Trump deal. And they said, we're going to have this gathering in the East Room, and we're just going to talk about the crisis and Melania's kind of ideas. And at the time, we didn't, now, but Trump's got a brother that's got substance use challenges, and he's very adamant about never drinking, and so I wasn't political, and I'm just pastor in Xenia. It really didn't, And so I was like, okay, so it's like a Tuesday, and the thing is a Thursday. And so we go in the room, and at the time I had been writing this blog about recovery called the Freedom Daily Dispatch, and it was just my thoughts about Jesus and recovery and stuff. And so the person they sit me next to the Postmaster General, and she's great. Yeah. And so we're just talking, and again, just talking, we're just people, And so she says, well, I want to subscribe to your blog. And I was like, okay, whatever, that's fine. And so the day starts to go on, and so my panel was at the time Ben Carson, Jeff Sessions, Alex Azer, who was HHS, Kellyanne Conway. And so, we have a question from Pastor Delaney. So I stand up, and thankfully others had told their story. And so I said, so at that time, I had 10 years or whatever. And people are clapping, and there were some tragic stories, moms and stuff, and lost kids. And so I got a chance to ask the question, and I got a chance to meet Alex Azer. And that developed into a relationship. And, he wouldn't pick me out of the lineup today, but it was super important because it was almost like, okay, there's a place for not only, a pastor kind of thing, but he was a very different faith. And so I asked my question. Well, then it starts to get chaotic in the room, because at the time it was just Melania and this group of people, right? It starts to get chaotic, and so there's all these things going on off to the left, and people coming in and cameras and everything, and then suddenly here comes all of these military dudes, and they're right down the middle aisle, and here comes Trump.
Wow.
And so he comes in, and like, wow, okay, yeah, that's amazing. and so I'm literally, I'm from me to the door here, and it was like, okay, this is crazy. But what was interesting, and this isn't a political ad for anybody, you can have whatever you want, but what was fascinating was 2 people down from me was a friend of his, and his friend had lost his son. And so this wasn't scripted, this wasn't part of the day. And he had that friend come up, and he said, is what we're doing going to help? And his son said, and the guy said, my son would be very proud of what you're trying to do. And then Eric Bowling, who had been part of Fox News for a really long time, Eric lost his son in Colorado. And Eric told his story about that the first person to call him when he found out about his son was Trump. And the first person to call him on Thanksgiving after his son was gone for the first holiday was him. And so it was just this very human moment. And again, it's not about, I'm not saying don't go vote for him, whatever you want to say. It's not about that. But it was interesting to watch. And looking back on it now, Aaron, it's this idea that in this space, all of us have stuff. And often we just need someone to give us permission to be authentic and vulnerable. And in that space, so much healing can happen. And it's such a different perception can happen about what we're dealing with and what we're working with. And so flash forward to today, the call is still the same, and You know, we're working really diligently. I've been in 41 states talking about recovery-friendly congregations. We've updated our toolkit. We're part of helping write a toolkit for mental health for churches. If someone would ask, was that all worth it? Yeah.
Yep.
Because it's where I found purpose. And that, when you look at recovery, right, and we look at those 12 factors that SAMHSA says and all that stuff, right? Home, health, community, and purpose. And I've been blessed to find all of it. And I don't take it for granted. But what I do love is I love being able to help people, whether it's individually one-on-one, or the folks that I get the blessing of working with and educating them, to say, look and see the story behind the story in the lives of the people that you're serving, and see the potential. See in them what God sees in them. Because in my life, Mark Brooks saw in me what he said God saw in me. That's
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and the amazing work that you are doing is just, it's incredible. And I'm so excited to see, because when we think back to, at least when I think back to the kind of the, 150 years ago, we didn't know how to treat people with an alcohol use disorder. And I mean, they tried different things, and Carl Jung and whatnot, but really the fundamentals of 12-step programs and looking at things that with Oxford and the Oxford group of being a very religious organization and whatnot, and some of that history and where we have come today. And churches are supposed to, congregations are supposed to be a place that people can go to for help. And that's where, feeling safe. So I think that work that you're doing is incredibly important, and I'm just really excited to see what's next.
Me too.
Yes.
I really am.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely.
Well, anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been incredible.